All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to the only coast to coast show all about the information economy. It's time for Inside Analysis. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh here. And folks, I am super excited and honored and humbled, frankly, to have an industry visionary and leader on the call today. Gajen Kandiah is the CEO of Rackspace. I'm sure you've heard about those folks. Pretty fascinating company. And he's doing some amazing things over there. He was formerly the CEO of Hitachi Vantara. So he's a data guy like me. We're going to align on the importance of data, especially data as the fuel for artificial intelligence. So, without further ado, Gajen Kandiah, welcome to the show. Welcome to Inside Analysis. Congratulations on all your success. Tell me what's going on out there. You've got this big deal with Palantir we'll talk about. Of course, Palantir is grabbing a lot of headlines.
hmm
What I love the most about their approach is their use of a knowledge graph. So, as I
hmm
understand it, all of their implementations leverage a knowledge graph. And some of the smartest people I've met in this industry realize it is an excellent component to a portfolio, to an architecture where you have your enterprise systems down below, your ERP, CRM, supply chain management. You build a knowledge graph on top of that. Then you have these MCP servers everyone keeps talking about. And then you hit the models. And if you do it right, you can really ground the responses from these models in your data, in your terminology, in your policies, and thus get good value from that stuff, right?
Yep. Again, first and foremost, Eric, thank you for having me on the show. I'm
Yeah.
actually been looking forward to this. And yes, I think, if I was to take one step back quickly, and sort of tie this down to customers, which is sort of where this all started.
Hmm.
My journey at Rackspace is about 7 months old, almost 7 months old in about a couple of weeks. And so I sort of came in and took the opportunity to go meet a ton of our customers just to understand sort of what's going on, where are they in this journey? Because I was coming from, as a customer when I was at Hitachi, and then, dealing with a number of industrial, rail, energy type customers. And so I thought in this case, let me go meet what is now a mostly regulated customer base on my private cloud side and an enterprise customer base on the public cloud side. And so as I did that, the thing that really jumped out at me was, things that you hear about all the time, right? There's significant amount of investment in pilots. I think there was a rush to pilot, if you will, which
Hmm.
I think you've seen, and I've heard some of your podcasts cover that. But most of them hit a wall, right? And by and large, what you hear and what the great news is that customers really understand that it's not a technology problem, it's actually a operational reality, right? As well as what I would term to be a deployment of AI into a governed or production environment problem, right? And I ran into this very same problem when I was, in my last role, where we built out this physical AI HMAX solution in pilot mode. But when it came to deploy, we didn't want any of our rail data. I mean, we were collecting 40,000 points of data every second on our
Wow.
trains, and we didn't want to get that data exposed to a closed model. And so we needed both a small or more of a specialized language model we needed to build, but then on top of that, we needed a place to run it, right? And that was run securely in production. And so that concept, while it was in the back of my mind, it got validated through the different conversations that I was having. And the point you were making earlier, right? Data is messy, compliance requirements are very, very real, and infrastructure isn't designed for workload, this type of
Right.
workload, right? And so
Right.
putting all of that together, we said, hey, look, we've been doing this for 25 years as Rackspace, right? This is sort of our kind of core capability. It's our DNA, which is essentially driving sort of, running mission critical infrastructure for customers over these years. Why don't we make that our differentiation? Now, to do that, then how do you tie it up in a way? Because what you find out, I call it the triple squeeze. I don't know if this makes sense or not, right? But hyperscalers come in or neo clouds come in, and they only care about consumption, right? So,
Hmm.
so they will give you the environment to go run, right? It's like they give you the lumber to build a house, but nobody's going to build a house for you. The GSIs come in and do the blueprinting work, and they tie all the pieces together, and they may build you the agent capability. But then, how does that stitch back into the infrastructure? Because today's world, everything is aligned and integrated, everything's interconnected. And then, lastly, you have the Palantirs, the Uniphores of the world, who are providing the platform, but then somebody needs to, design, deploy, and operate that platform for our customers. And there's this, and to me, that seemed like a great opportunity for us because we've been doing this infrastructure and critical infrastructure management for customers. Why don't I move upstream, build the partnerships from Palantir into Epic, for instance, for healthcare, or
Mm,
Finacle for financial services, down to the control plane with a VMware, with a cyber resilience framework with Rubrik or with Cohere, and deliver that as a sort of an opinionated, loosely integrated platform with forward deployed engineers. And therein was the reason to go talk to Palantir to say, guys, look, we think we can do this and run it in the long term for you.
right.
And that opened that door. So sorry for the long form answer, but
No,
hopefully it gives you
that's
some context for how we
that.
ended up.
No, that's wonderful. Well, because we're dealing with a new stack, essentially.
Yes.
And yes, the frontier models have grabbed all the headlines, but that doesn't mean they're doing everything or ever will do everything.
Yeah.
And it's really important to understand what they do well and what they don't do well, and how you can integrate them into your environment. And you touched on a whole bunch of different components.
Yeah.
For example, the security. I mean, AI is great for people who know how to use it, including the bad guys. And the
Yes.
black hats
Absolutely.
are now ramping up activity like there's no tomorrow. So to have this top to bottom stack that is tightly integrated and has a lot of observability baked
Yeah.
into it, you're giving peace of mind to the
Mhm.
CIOs, to the CISOs, to everyone, to the CEOs, because that's a huge concern and it will never go away, right?
Yeah. It is, and the thing to realize that I realized it somewhat after the fact, right? Is Eric that if you're building, let's coming from the top, if you're building an app on top of an agent layer,
Hmm.
that building that needs to account for what language model, whether it's yours, small, specialized, or large, right? Um, how do you want to orchestrate that? Where do you want to inference it, right? What is the
Hmm.
most efficient way to inference? Are you going to run on an AMD compute layer? Are you going to run on a TPU? Do you care, right? If you're an enterprise, do you care? You just want the cheapest tokens to be utilized based on what your workload is. And so if I'm a forward deployed engineer, if it's you or me out there with a customer, I need to know every step of that journey, right? So
Hmm.
it's no longer sending an architect and saying, hey, give me the blueprint and here's your reference data architecture. Thank you very much. It's actually getting your hands dirty and in the mud and actually building it all the way through and plumbing it, if you will, all the way down
Hmm. Hmm.
into the compute layer. And I think there's a huge gap there, right? I'm trying my best to fill that gap as quickly as possible with the partnerships that we're talking about.
Hmm. Well, and to get the best value from these systems, you really do need to, at least someone in your organization needs to understand the stack, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they talk about the full stack developer, which is kind of rare these days because it's
Mhm.
just so complicated. And then, of course, these agent frameworks are adding another whole layer of complexity. And it can be fantastic. It can work very well, or it can do bad things, which we saw was Amazon 14-hour
Yeah.
outage. That's a
Yeah.
bit of a problem, right?
Yep.
I mean, and there is a lot of FUD out there, as they call it. So this is why I love to do these shows and talk to folks like yourself to really strip away the marketing veneer and get down to the brass tacks of what's actually happening
A-
here. And
Absolutely, right. So when I say FDEs, right, or forward deployed engineers, I kind of tell my team, the company, we had our town hall yesterday, everybody has to become one, right? I can't run this in the
mm,
background.
hmm.
Right? I need to be in front of customers. If I'm in finance, you need to be in front of the customers because you can't, these new outcome services, right? You don't just model them in the back office, right? You actually sit with the customer and figure out what it is. But at a macro level, I feel like, I kind of evaluate FDEs as sort of these master plumbers, but they get embedded into, an outcome pod, or they get embedded into, a post-sale accelerator for a customer to then rapidly deploy, or into an enablement team, or into like a production SWAT team to solve some problems that they may have. But at the end of the day, I kind of think of them as the guides, right? The Sherpas, if you will, right? They carry the load. They've done this 100 times, or they haven't, but they've done this many times, more times than the customer has, and they show you what the pitfalls are and they gauge, and we're learning along the way, right? This isn't a one
Right.
and done, right? We are learning along the way. And so building the FDE model to not be a singular role, but sort of a distributed set of roles, right?
Wow.
That partner with customers at different points of their journey or live
Hmm.
with the customer
Hmm.
and do the plumbing, right? To me, that I hate to keep using the term plumbing and lumber, right? I'm building a house next door, so it's sort of in the back of
Right. All the
my
time.
mind, right? But I find that so important to help a customer or to partner with a customer to go from pilot to production, and
Hmm.
in a really fully governed, secure production. And because we focus on regulated industries like healthcare, financial services, energy, or critical infrastructure, that
Hmm.
becomes a huge part of the journey. So that's kind of how I think about FDEs in that context.
Oh, and it's a wonderful concept, and Palantir really pioneered this
Yes.
concept, and now you see it other places too. People are figuring out, yeah, it's actually very helpful because there is so much complexity in the top to bottom stack.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's so many layers to understand. Things are changing so quickly. That's the other side of the equation is
Yeah.
that these models are learning very quickly, and of course, they're black boxes, right?
Yes.
ChatGPT, it's funny they call it OpenAI. I like to joke it should be called closed AI now because it's been closed for a while now.
It has.
And
Yeah.
regulators don't like black boxes,
Hmm.
right? I
True.
mean,
True.
because you want to know what it's doing and how it's doing that. And so what that means is if you're using these frontier models in your workflows, your guardrails need to be somewhere outside of that, either in your
Yeah.
MCP or in your knowledge graph or in a rules-based system or somewhere,
Yeah.
but the onus is on you as the organization, facilitated by the forward deployed engineer, to get that right, correct?
Exactly, exactly, and I think this is where sort of either the ontology from Palantir, right, or the data and knowledge layer that comes from Unifor, they provide us the ability to discover and interconnect, right, the messy middle, if you will, right, which is all
Right.
about the data, and they provide us the interconnection points. They give us the traceability of the data, right, all of the things that you don't get with the traditional large language model, right? And by and large, I see, further the deeper we go in with our regulated customers, we see an increasing need for small and specialized language models, right? That are very right. So exactly, right. Um,
Thumbs up on that.
yeah, and then agents built on top of that, right? Back
Right.
to your point about knowledge graphs, it's critically important that the accuracy. I think I listened to one of your in one of your podcasts, you had said, look, 10%, like who wants to be wrong 10% of the time, right?
Right.
And if you're
Kind of a
treating
big
a
deal.
patient post-op, you don't want to
Right.
be wrong 10% of the time, right?
That's right.
So that's where I'm focusing our talent, because ultimately bringing those types of workloads into production, I think make a real difference. And I think that given our heritage and the DNA we have, I think we are very well positioned to focus there.
Yeah, that's very, very good news. And I think you've hit the nail on the head here in multiple different ways. You are correct that it is the plumbing and you need observability and you need to be
Mhm.
able to ask questions. And the small language models, I remember thinking about this like 2, 3 years ago now. And it's funny. So one of my best friends in the business, you may even know him. He was a Yahoo guy years ago, Usama Fayyad.
Yeah.
These days he
Oh
runs
my
the
God.
yeah,
Usama
yeah.
was on my advisory council at Hitachi for AI.
Nice,
That's so
nice.
funny. He lives here in Boston too.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. So yeah,
Yeah.
he's the head of the Northeastern University, I think.
Northeastern. Yeah.
The
My daughter goes there and I ended up meeting him. So yeah, that's
Look at
that's
that.
that's a small world.
Yeah, yeah. So the Institute for Experiential AI, I
Yes.
think is what they call
Yes.
it. So human in the loop. And I interviewed him, gosh, I guess it's 2 years ago now.
Okay.
I mean, I interviewed him 20 years ago. I booked him for an event in the year 2001
Okay.
called BI Vision in Chicago. In October of 2001, I had a guy named Usama as my keynote. Okay, so do the math on that. It was pretty fun. But he's the nicest guy. And he's so
He
smart.
is. He
And he
is.
said to me something about these large language models. I said, these large language models, they're too big. We don't know why they work. They're not supposed to work. I'm thinking, what? You were at Yahoo in the
Yeah.
Hadoop days for crying
Yeah.
out loud. I mean, this
Yeah.
guy is extremely knowledgeable, but his point was they are huge and we don't
Hmm.
understand them. And
Yeah.
so you have to contain that appropriately with guardrails. We keep hearing about guardrails, and they
Yeah.
are rules. They need to be deterministic. You need to have a path to remediation, and like all
Hmm.
this stuff needs to be thought through. and documented. But the beautiful thing, we got our first break coming up here in about 2 minutes or so.
Mhm.
But the beautiful thing is, to your point about everyone being a forward deployed engineer, anyone, especially if you use the kind of system that Palantir talks about with the knowledge base, the ontology, and you really
Mhm.
bring your enterprise data into the picture, your contracts, all this stuff.
Yep.
The beautiful thing is anyone in the organization can learn about any part of the process anytime they want,
Yes.
right?
Yes, very true. Very true. Single point of data, right? Like, like in the old days of master data, but here with an interface, right? And the
Hmm.
interface could be multifold, right? All the way up to the AIP layer. I'll give you a great example because you're coming up on break. I think it might be a good example to use here. So I was so intrigued. I actually was intrigued by Palantir before coming and joining Rackspace. And so I did a ton of research, and that's how I kind of learned about forward deployment and so on and so forth. Um, and so one of the things that we did, we said, look, if we're going to do this, we need to, the words I've been given to use is, drink our own champagne. So
Yeah,
I
right.
said, okay, let's go drink our own champagne. And in the last couple of days, we tried it on one of our ERP apps, right? And I got a note last night. So 2 days later, I got a note saying we got an entire end-to-end process up and running in 2 days
Wow.
with an interface built that is a chat-based interface. Um, and we migrated all the data we needed to and have a completely standalone instance with no connectivity to our core ERP that we were using, all in two
Wow.
days, right? And that
Wow.
was using ontology. It was using the AIP layer. And the ability to migrate data, the ability to build these tooling as quickly as possible once the ontology is done is just mind-boggling, right? Because you fundamentally break the old world of process-based
Right.
outcomes, right? And you're now sort of more, user-based outcomes, so experience-based out, like whatever the outcome is you want to derive, you
Right.
control the outcome. And I think that is just phenomenal.
Well, and that's true. And we'll pick this up after the break, folks, because the velocity of innovation is off the charts now. And that's what's exciting, but it's also what's a little bit concerning. But folks, don't
Agreed.
touch it. That will be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, a fascinating show already with Gajen Kandiah. He's the CEO of Rackspace, pretty cool company out there. They have a big partnership with Palantir, but lots of partnerships. He's focusing on partnerships for the full stack and a real emphasis on forward deployed engineers and on really helping his employees and his teams and his partners view the world in a new way because it is very interesting what's happening. I'll give another example. I was going to talk about AI ERP. I'll talk about that in a second, maybe. But I had a lady on the show a few weeks ago, very sharp lady, Sharon Guy,
Hmm.
Gai. She jokes Guy like AI. She ran the ML ops for Alibaba's
Oh,
retail
okay.
division. So, that's a person who knows a thing or two.
Yeah.
And she just wrote a book all about the AI era. And she says, look, for the last 2026 years or so, we've been in the AD period as opposed to BC. And she views the AI era as like a next inflection point of that magnitude in terms of
Yeah.
how things get done. Maybe not in terms of religion, but in terms of how things get done. And it was very interesting. On the cover of the book is a worker bee sitting on a little honeycomb. And she
Okay.
said, all the way up until today, we human beings were all little worker bees. And we go out, zzz, get the pollen, come back, do our stuff, do our jobs. She said, in the future, we need to be like beekeepers.
Mm.
And we'll be beekeepers, and the agents will be doing the work. Well, that is a huge inflection point.
Yeah.
And, I'll give you another analogy and just kind of let you respond to it. I thought to myself, with this Gen AI stuff in particular, we've spent the last 45, 50 years really building out and optimizing the data infrastructure for information systems. At the
Hmm.
foundation is the database, and we spent years making them faster, more performant, more scalable, more storage, more concurrent users. All these things were great, but there's one thing that was never in question, and that was you always got out of the database what you put into the database.
Yes.
With Gen AI, it's almost like we've thrown a noise filter on the end of this pristine 45, 50-year process because it's probabilistic. So
Yeah.
it's like, well, why would you do that? And the short answer is because they're so powerful and they're so
Hmm.
interesting, but we do need to be careful about that. So we are at this huge inflection point. Lots of people are very concerned about AI taking their jobs, and there's reason for that concern. I think mostly it's an excuse being used by some of these boards. I don't think it's
Hmm.
really because of AI that they're laying people off. I'll just kind of throw that out
Yep.
there.
Okay.
But
Fair
what do
enough.
you think about all that? I mean, this is a huge inflection point. It will take strong leadership, empathy, the heart, as my friend Sarang Bapat from Mitsubishi Electric said yesterday on our show. It's going to
Yeah.
take really strong leadership to get folks through this period, which is tremendously transformative. What do you think?
And I think been in this space like you over 30 years at this point, Eric, and it couldn't be anything more profound than what you just said, right? I mean, it's just like it really is. And it isn't, to your point, it isn't a fundamental sort of, I think there might be an overabundance of focus on the concept of cost takeout, right? I
Right.
kind of think of this as efficiency and opportunity.
Hmm.
And, I use my own example. When I was interviewing for Rackspace, everything I did, normally it would have taken me, discussions with a couple of consulting companies, download all of these, earnings reports and try to put it all together, right? Everything I did with either Claude or OpenAI or ChatGPT, right?
Right.
And I needed to go double check every single thing, make sure the numbers were right, and so on and so forth. But its ability to make me significantly more productive and
Right.
much, the velocity topic that we talked about, drive outcome much faster than I would have with any consultant or, even with a small army of people helping me was tremendous. And it was my work. Right? There was
Right.
this pride of having done it myself and
Right.
then got the job, right? Maybe risky in its own right, right? But
That's
but
funny.
but that was tremendously sort of insightful to me because you're right. I think even within Rackspace, we are building these ambassador programs, and the ambassador programs is all about training people and then letting them into the wild of Rackspace to enable and support our teams in the field,
Wow.
our functional teams, our ITS teams, our go-to-market teams, so that we are bringing, and then continue to develop the ambassador teams, helping our teams build their own set of solutions so that we can move internally as well as externally with customers because we can't be telling customers what to do if we are not doing it for ourselves, right? We are running, Claude and OpenAI or ChatGPT enterprise program training for the entire leadership team. Because if you're in the leadership team and you're going to guide talent who is already native AI by and large to do things, you need to understand what you're asking them to do and how you're
Yeah.
asking them to do it, right? To the point about the bees and sort of the beekeeper versus sort of doing the work. I think that by and large that transition will occur, but the number of beekeepers needed would also, I think, magnify.
Right.
Right? This isn't going to be just about, I think in some ways we think of it saying the universe of work isn't going to change. We're just going to have less beekeepers to manage that universe of work, right?
Mm.
But the reality is, I think the, I was having a conversation at a summit I was at last week. The most advanced engineer some of these people have come back and say we are 100x more productive using Claude Code or Codex, right?
Hmm.
And the CEO there said, look, if my best guy is 100x more productive, and I already thought he was 10x more productive than the average programmer, who's pretty darn good, right?
Right.
Then what does that mean? How much more velocity can I create in my value chain, in my product development, in my engineering, right? I think we tend to think of it as how many people can I exit rather than saying how much more can I get done in a shorter period of time, right?
Right.
And I think that that is an opportunity being if indeed people are getting laid off because of AI, and it's not because maybe we overhired during COVID
Right.
or whatever, right?
That's right.
Uh, I actually think that that might be the wrong thing to do right now. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand is sort of a topic that's near and dear to me is undergrads are native right out of the gate.
That's
Why the
right.
heck are we not hiring them?
Right.
Right? Why are
That's
we
right.
leaving them on, just, because they can be the Sherpas to your middle layer of your management team, of your leadership team, right?
Sure.
Because these guys haven't touched this stuff, right? Whereas the native guys can come in and show you what you can do with it. So there is so many things that are just go against the grain, I feel. And maybe it's the FUD factor being created around it, and maybe it's not, but we think of it completely differently, right? Like, I want to run a cohort of 20 people to say, hey, look, get me undergrads, get me high school grads, and get me grad students, put them all in a cohort, right? Run them through Palantir and Unifor and tell me which group picks it up faster, right?
Wow.
Do I really need to wait to hire this talent that is, from a particular school with a particular degree, or can I just really ramp up my talent where they're at and give them the tooling and let them run? Um,
Well, those are excellent points, and it's very encouraging. I agree with your philosophy much more so than what is being put out there. And again, I question a lot of what's happening. I'm a media guy, and I'd say in general, be very wary about what you read
Fair
in the
enough.
media. Because, I mean, not to get off topic, but the mass media is really not incentivized to share rational, calming information. They are incentivized to share irrational, fearful information, basically. And we really don't want that. But I want to get into another really
Yeah.
interesting topic that I think you're going to agree with. This is fascinating. So, historically, the barriers to innovation have been, of course, hardware and then coding. I mean, coders were a big barrier. You had to get good coders. I remember a few years ago, the whole story was like 3, 4, 5 years ago of directors of development and just keeping your team. Don't lose your team no matter what you do. Well, now coding is not a barrier. Now,
Yeah.
if anything, the barrier is on the business side to articulate what they want and to manage the execution of the innovation. But you can spin up code in almost no time. What it used to
Yeah.
take weeks can take hours. And you do have to preen it. You do have to pay attention. These engines get you 80% of the way there, and that last 20% is very important. But still, the knowledge is no longer a barrier because you can just look up anything. Coding is no longer a barrier. Really, it's on the business side now to leverage these things responsibly. That's where the holdup is now, right?
It is, and I think that in many organizations, Eric, the guardrails are still the old guardrails.
Hmm.
And so even some cases giving access to programmers to, Cursor or Cloud Code or, any of these coding tools is somewhat limited, right? And the licensing is somewhat limited. There's a fear of overusage of tokens, right? You have all of that noise in the market as well,
Right.
where, hey, I gave it my credit card and maxed out my credit card really quickly, right? Um, but in my mind, if you don't begin to really enable your organization to embrace this technology and not just give access, but train and nurture your
Right.
teams to be capable of doing it, you then end up falling behind very, very quickly, right? I mean, the pace at which you fall behind in this environment is tremendous. And I think what to your point, there is sort of an emerging reality that I'm myself just coming up to speed on is voice-based programming, right? Using something like, no, I rarely type now, right?
Hmm.
I use Whisper AI for pretty much everything, right?
Hmm.
And then yesterday I heard that Cloud Code launched Dispatch, which is remote control, right?
Hmm.
So technically, and I'm not there yet, but technically I could be on a walk with my dog while I'm programming using Whisper
Right.
AI and Cloud Code Dispatch, right?
Right.
And that's just mind blowing, right? To be able to do things like that. But it changes the engagement. I find myself being capable of putting so much more input in a much lesser period of time in context and provide a lot more context for a prompt or for a particular problem I'm trying to research or so voice is one aspect of it. The other one, very specific to the point you raised, is there is now the opportunity to have a visual discussion
Hmm.
rather than a textual discussion. Right? You can go into Lovable or Replit or Claude even and say, here's the type of dashboard I want to be creating to be able to track and manage this particular initiative or this customer or whatever. I can go to my IT team, or I can go to my team and say, guys, this is what it looks like.
Hmm.
It's no longer like if you remember the old days, right? We used to sit down and do scoping and design and, UI frameworks and all of this stuff. I, Today, within an hour or less than that, I can come up with all of that in very specifically what I want as a customer and say, guys, this is sort of what I'm looking for. Here's a workflow I'm looking for, right? That type of value has not yet been fully internalized and I think exploited, if you will, for better word of using.
Right.
And I think that gives a customer tremendous control, but they need to use it. That's sort of my,
Hmm.
my, my main point.
No, I think you're exactly right. And the interactivity, the reason I love radio and love these conversations is that a one-on-one synchronous conversation can get very deep very quickly, as opposed to a 1 hour presentation, which is linear and offline, if you will. Like old media is linear, it's offline. You had to wait till 7 p.m. on Tuesday to watch your favorite show. Well, now you can get your favorite show anywhere, anytime on streaming
Yeah.
services. All these things have changed. That doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. That doesn't mean having a regimen no longer matters. It does matter. It almost matters even more
Yeah.
because the fact that you can do anything anytime means you have to be more careful about how you use your time. And I think that's actually one of the big challenges right now is just helping people figure out in for their own personality, their own biorhythms,
Hmm.
what's the right way to use these things and come up with plans, come up with ways that make sense for you. But to your point, use the tools, play around with these tools to kind of understand and nurture your team so that they are not afraid. We got about 2 minutes left. Go
Yeah.
ahead. I missed
So
that.
I think so. This bringing it back to sort of what we are doing at Rackspace, Eric, is exactly answering that question, right? Most of my customers are in that sort of space, right? And so bringing them this ability to with a integrated stack and
Hmm.
allowing them to not worry about all of the stuff that sits below, including security, right?
Right,
And focus on the outcomes that they want and test the use cases they want to build and then
right.
help them deploy and run them. That accelerates their journeys, right? And to
Yeah.
me, that's a huge gap that I think that not anyone can solve. Hyperscalers can't solve it, GSIs can't solve it, platforms can't solve it. And so that is a unique position I feel that we have with forward deployed engineering to go solve.
Wow. That's brilliant. I mean, it's very, very, very smart because again, the rate of change has just dramatically increased.
Yeah,
And now you can do things much faster. Not that you want to. You don't want to be running with scissors, as they
yeah,
say. I remember my child once was running with scissors, like literally, I'm like, okay, my child is running with scissors. I've clearly failed as a parent in this
yeah,
moment. And that is kind of what's happening, like with Claude Bot and
yeah,
Open Claw. Some of the stories I heard just yesterday. One of my best friends, one of the smartest guys I know, set it all up. And when it ran out of tokens, it started messaging his friends asking for money, and he had to turn it off. It's like, whoa, slow down, buddy. It's like an intern that's incredibly enthusiastic
yeah.
and really wants to please the boss and goes and does everything, but takes the whole house down.
I
It's like,
know.
all right, we
Yeah.
gotta hold on for that.
I
But
was
folks,
blocked. I was banned from using it. So I
that's
can,
hilarious.
yeah, I
That's
was told
really
like,
funny.
here's a Mac Mini. Go work with that and keep it completely off our network.
All right, folks, we'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to Gajen Kandiah. He is the CEO of Rackspace, very cool company, doing a lot of work with Palantir and lots of partners. And you mentioned a story about ERP and how your team was able to design a new end-to-end process in ERP in 2 days. Well, I've spent a lot of time studying SAP. Of course, they are the Goliath in the ERP space, have been for years. Not that they're the only one. There are lots of others out there of smaller ERPs and interesting ones. But the era of AI ERP, as it's called, is upon us. And one of the companies I've interviewed, Everest Systems, one of their chief technologists was on the show, and he was actually showing me a demo. And it's unbelievable the things that can be done these days. And what I'd say is that the mindset of the business is what needs to change. Now, you do have to
Mhm.
be careful about how you use these things, but he's basically what they do is they have a system where you define what it is you're trying to build and just get very specific about what you want it to be. And then when you're ready, you hit the enter button and it bangs out the specs for you. And the quote that he gave me, which just blew my mind, he said, no human being can write specs like this.
Mm.
Like,
Oh, really?
it's
Yeah.
just, you can't because it's too complicated for a human being to wrap their heads around. And that's a really interesting point to make because, again, you still have to proof everything and make sure you just walk through the whole process and understand. But to be able to spin up, that's the one thing ERP was never good at.
Yeah.
ERP was robust and rigid, and it always worked because you didn't allow free play. And then you
Mhm.
have cases like greenfield versus brownfield upgrades, and oh, I mean,
Yeah.
the menace of upgrading, and SAP is trying to push everyone into S4 HANA, and Hasso, very very smart guy, Hasso Plattner, he's one of my heroes, quite frankly. He's a very funny guy. I saw him at the Sapphire a few years ago, and he had a slide up on. He's doing a keynote. He's got a slide up there that said 70% of all the world's business runs through SAP, and he just looked at it and goes, I do not believe this slide. That's what he said about his own slide. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're my hero. But so he saw the future of Flash, and in
Yeah,
memory, but I don't think he saw large language models coming. But what do you think about this? The fact that now, for core business,
yeah.
you can spin up whole new processes in a matter of days. That is a massive transformation, right?
It is, and interestingly enough, I kind of come at it in my mind at least, Eric. There are sort of three vectors or methods that I see customers struggling with and or framing this. One is I think a functional mechanism, right? I think of it sort of what can I do in finance, HR, marketing, sort of functionally, how do I use agents to make my teams more productive and efficient or effective?
Yeah,
The second one is ERP, right? And this is where, like, what happened in the last couple of months with the stock market and where at least the concerns in the market about SaaS and software.
right.
I think that we have to begin to think about rails where machines talk to machines,
Hmm.
right? Not, it's not all a user interface anymore, right?
Right,
And in that's the case, then licensing changes, right? Because where you and I may have each needed a license, there may be an agent that would replace all five of our four or five of our licenses, and still deliver the same outcome, right? So that is sort of at the ERP level, and then the third piece is sort of what I think of as durable long-term change, which is completely reimagining processes with agents at the core, right? It's no
mm-hmm.
longer a human process, right? And if it's not a human process, it doesn't need to follow the same steps that a human
Right,
would follow,
right,
right? Because it can do things in parallel and it can do things 24 by 7, right? And so it takes all of that limitation off the table. And different companies come at it in different ways. But when it comes to ERP and AI, to me, even if you're SAP, the migration to SAP for HANA is a long journey, right? I mean,
right.
and it sometimes takes 2, 3 years to do that migration, depending on the size of the company. There are now tools, including with Palantir, that can do that in less than
Right.
10 weeks.
That's crazy.
Right? Think about the acceleration, the velocity. Again, I think the key word you touched on, which sort of triggered this for me, is the velocity of getting work done has changed. It doesn't mean
Right,
everybody's out there to replace Oracle or SAP, but the type of work you want to do and the pace at which you want to do it, and then how do you utilize agents and humans
right,
together, right? And design initially with human in loop, but over time with autonomous agents, with the concept of humans as the governance mechanism, um,
right.
will change, right? And you need to be able to think through all of that stuff in real time. And therein
Right.
comes the Sherpas and the forward deployed engineers, and because it's a fundamental mind shift, right?
Hmm.
We've been doing this the same way for so many years
That's right.
that thinking subtly this way is just fundamentally different. And so that's why I think AI and ERP are going to have a coming together moment if it hasn't happened already. And the focus needs to be on outcomes, not on
Hmm.
process.
That's right. Yeah,
Right.
that's exactly right. And all this stuff can be redesigned. Stefan Sig, by the way, is the guy's name. He was at
Ah,
Software AG and now he's over at Everest ERP. But you're exactly right. And this gets back to the innovation possibilities and the sky's the limit, basically. And the cloud is the limit, I guess, right? The sky's
yeah,
the limit. You can do things in new ways. And that's good news because guess what? What did my buddy Sammy Akpe said on the show just yesterday? He said, oh, you don't wake up and say, hey, I want to go fix some data pipelines, said no one
yeah,
ever. That's not the fun part. The fun
yeah,
part is playing with the data, coming up with new ideas, and then executing. And what's exciting to me is that the path from ideation to execution is so much shorter now.
yeah,
And that means you can fail fast forward. That means you can try new things and have fun. It's
yeah.
fun. Like the other guy,
It
another
is
guy
fun.
said something funny yesterday. He goes, yeah, back in the day, you'd compile your code, and if it compiled, you thought, okay, it works. Like it's perfect. I'm like, no, it,
Yeah,
it compiled. That doesn't mean it's going to do what you wanted it to
it's
do.
true.
So there is still all this sort of troubleshooting and
Yeah.
checking and guiding that we need to do, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And to the point on fun, right? Somebody was asking me just about when I joined Rackspace, like how much do you have in the tank? And I was like, guys, since 23. there is no tank, right? Like, the energy and the excitement and the fun you can have with this, and this is way before agents and MCP and CLI
Right.
and all of it. Like it was mind-boggling back then, and today it's only sort of ratcheted up in a very, very fundamental way. But that said, I do think what I worry about the most is our customers, right? Again, back to, like think about it this way. Like, there's so much we hear about, GTC, we heard about, now this ability to create, trillions of tokens as needed. And like there's this, everything is on the infrastructure layer
Hmm.
and compute layer, right? It's sort of all the noise is there, right? And the language models. My customers don't think about that stuff. They get excited by it, but that's not a day-to-day problem in an operation,
Right.
right? And because they're trying to figure out like where do I play? How do I play? Who do I work with? And can I even keep up?
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
Because it's changing. Like,
right.
I don't know. I wake up at 4 a.m. to try to keep up, like every day, just to say, like, what am I going to miss something? Right? I'm completely paranoid about missing something.
That's
But
funny.
imagine that a customer has to go through this, and not every person in a customer organization is doing that, nor should do that. And somebody needs to take that off their hands, right? And say, look, let me worry about it, um, while you worry about the outcomes you want. And I will create it in a way that it's modular and interchangeable as
Interesting.
technology changes.
Right.
And I need to get increasingly more credible at doing that because nobody really knows the answer, neither do we. And so
Right.
in my mind, you have to be honest with yourself and with your customer, but go on the journey together.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It is a journey. And I really love that you are focusing on helping customers because to them, the infrastructure just gets you there.
Yeah.
Another fascinating quote, and our last break is coming up here in just a minute, but I had a fascinating guy, Suresh Srinivas. He was one of the co-founders of Hortonworks on the show a couple weeks ago. Now, here's a guy who spent over a decade of his life building structure around big data to be able to leverage it. And really, a lot of the work they did
Hmm.
enabled what we're seeing now, right? Because big
Yep.
data is the fuel for these algorithms and for these large language models to use. But here's a guy who spent his career focused on structured data. And in the post call after the show, we were just chit chatting, and he said something to me that just blew my mind. He said, structured data is an implementation detail. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking to myself, what a brilliant observation, because you can get lost in you can
Yeah.
lose the forest for the trees, right? And think that tables and schemas and ontologies, that's the value. No, that's the scaffolding
Yeah.
that gets you
Exactly.
up to the top floor to be able to see in the window, to know what's happening and to make your next decision. So the key is always the semantics, it's always the understanding and then the execution. And that's what you're enabling at Rackspace right now with Palantir. Well, we got our podcast bonus segment coming up here, folks. Fascinating show. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment. A fascinating show with Gajen Kandiah, CEO of Rackspace. And Gajen, I'm so happy to hear you talk about nurturing your teams. I'm so happy to hear you talk about small language models. I had this idea 2.5 years ago. I wrote about it before going to Boomi World with Steve Lucas as CEO, another
Hmm.
great guy. Thought
Yep.
to myself, I called it the executive cockpit. And the idea was that now you can build a small language model in your own data center in Rackspace, for example, private cloud, train it on whatever data you've got, ERP, CRM, supply chain, whatever, all the data that you can muster. Then you set up Kafka topics from your enterprise systems to your vector store. And what is the
Hmm.
end result of all this? The CEO can then sit there and ask any question anytime about anything, like where are we in terms of pipeline compared to marketing budget in the Southeast region, for example.
Yep.
Well, think about this. Historically, as a senior executive, you have meetings of your direct reports. You all come in, give updates and things. Now, you've already got all the updates. You already know what's happening. You don't need to ask people what's happening. You can find out yourself, which means you could focus on tackling the challenges of the business. That
Yep.
completely changes the nature of executive meetings. You're no longer just listening and trying to figure out in real time and then saying, and the other side of the equation is, Steve had this great quote when I interviewed him for Reuters years ago. He said, "People know when you're lying." He just said that. I thought it was funny because people will hide information,
Yes.
and that's kind of out the window too which is a bit scary, but you have fiefdoms around data, and those days are ending, it seems to me. And
Hmm.
I think that's excellent news for everyone because we can all know what's happening, and that supports teamwork and actually collaborating and getting things done. But what do you think?
1000%. So I know Steve's a great guy, and I remember he made the pitch, the Boomi pitch to me when I was at Hitachi.
Okay,
And at
that's
that
funny.
time, it was weird, right? It was hard to get anybody to really buy off on it, right? It was a licensing cost conversation rather than the opportunity of and what he was
Right,
building, right, at Boomi.
right,
But he's spot on, right? And I believe that, and my team is will resonate or maybe scare my team, right? But I've asked them to say, hey, can I not have an agent at the table in our ELT meetings and in our
mhm,
SLT meetings? Right?
right,
Every update is captured, right? We
right,
building a twin of the ELT.
wow,
Everything is captured. If there's any question, you just basically, prompt it and ask it, where were we last week? Have we made any progress?
right,
Right? And nobody wants to put their hand up to say, I want to build that for you, right? Because I think to your point, I think in many ways, the information was king, right? The data you had was king, and how you presented and how you framed it, and it was all part of sort of the corporate dance, if you will, right? Eventually, maybe we get it in the boardroom, right? Is there going to be an agent-based board member, or even just an agent that is purely
right.
capturing board meetings? And I don't know how the SEC would react to something like that, or what kind of regulations will play into that. But you're right. I think that you can have there was a wonderful term that I had heard when I was at Hitachi about this concept of organizational knowledge being encapsulated in one place,
Hmm.
where that would become the new culture of the company, right?
Wow.
That you would integrate all of this, and you would have everybody would have access to it, somewhat Palantir-like in many ways, right? That
Hmm.
that it's the ontology that's built, and and the interface built into the ontology that then gave access to everyone within the right access parameters.
Sure.
And it truly changed the way an organization would operate, right? Because it's
Right.
a very transparent, forward-leaning, AI first, for lack of a better way of describing it, but sort of organization that I think could be fundamentally move faster than
Yeah.
anybody else in a competitive environment. So I,
Okay.
I I fully subscribe to Steve's point of view there. I think, and to the point you're making, Eric, it's very, very real.
Yeah, and it can be wonderful if done appropriately. To your
Correct.
point, you have to have guardrails in
Yep.
place around who has access to what kind of information, all that stuff can be done. But it's like a lot of the structure that we baked into systems isn't really necessary now. And when you think about, like one of the interesting things that the CTO of Boomi said a couple years ago, I guess about a year and a half ago, said was, we asked ourselves this question, do we still need APIs?
Mhm.
And the answer is, well, yes, you do, but be
Yep.
open-minded about how, because the agents are going to change everything. We're still not there yet. I mean, some of the most forward-looking and disciplined companies are rolling these things out. There are ethical concerns too about some of the things that are happening out there. But when you think about, to your point, the fact that they work 24/7, they don't get tired, they don't ask for a raise, all kind of stuff like that. That's good if they're bound appropriately.
Correct.
And my other buddy, Sammy Akbe, says that's in the tool selection. So don't let the LLM make decisions for you. That's not its job.
Yeah.
But the agents with enough instruction and enough tight guardrails will do amazing things. And again, that frees you up to do your cool stuff and have fun, right?
Absolutely. And this is, you nailed it, right? Because in regulated industries, it becomes even more real, right? And so when I think about this for us, right, governed AI for regulated industries is sort of how I come at it, right? To say in healthcare and life sciences, you have to deal with HIPAA, data sovereignty, governed patient data. In financial services, you're dealing with regulated compliance, model governance, audit trails, right? And our model, like and that's why I feel like you have to build these models in a very composite way that is integrated to the industry, right? On top of an Epic, on top of Finacle, on top of Schlumberger, because those are the business operations backbone. And we
Yes.
want to build like the AI operations backbone, and you integrate
Right.
those pieces together, and then customers can do some of these things in a more secure, governed environment. And that's sort of a gap that needs to be filled. And
Right.
And as much as it sounds like a sales pitch, it's actually a reality, right? I just feel like somebody needs to do it,
Right.
right?
That's funny.
And so why not us?
That's brilliant. And it's one of the I'll close on one of the best quotes I've heard about guardrails. Someone once said, and this will never get out of my mind because it was so brilliant. He said, "Look, seatbelts are like guardrails. Seatbelts don't slow you down.
No,
They prevent you from being harmed when you hit something, right? So you can still drive
it's true.
quickly. It doesn't slow you down at all. It's just there to protect you, and that's what guardrails are for. And what better place to have guardrails than in the infrastructure layer? Some of my favorite people are over at Hammerspace, which you're probably familiar with. They're doing amazing things, like
Yeah,
all kinds of cool things are happening, but more cool things can happen. And the key is to do it responsibly, ethically, nurture your teams, and focus on that enterprise data, folks. Well, look this gentleman up online, Gajen Kandiah, Gajen, and last name Kandih. Rackspace, very cool company. Send me an email if you want to be in the show, info@insideanalysis.com. We'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.